version. My whole garden is all put to sleep nicely. I've never had it in such good shape at this time of the year as this year. And I hauled in 2 cubic yards of compost. 6 hours. I've run them through here with dollies. And 1 minute, Jerry, and
Say what?
1 minute and we'll start.
Okay.
It's been on the average now 4 times as many people outside of the classrooms as inside. I know almost all of them who they are.
Well, do you have your pocket recorder ready to go?
Oh yeah, good idea. Okay, I think we can start.
No, we should be going.
Now, the last time we met was 3 weeks ago, and the entire talk was a side trip or a detour, or if you want to get fancy, it could be called an exegesis. And the side trip was prompted by an ironic observation of the talk that preceded it. And it was about something that all of the talks that preceded had in them. And that observation was that not much visual material accompanied the talks to help complete the thoughts in them. And the talk last time was about completing thoughts by giving them form. So we made some vague diagrams that were a little bit hokey, and they were visual aids. And when I look back at that talk, more insights came to me. And some of the new insights were corrective of the corrective thought. One insight was that since the talks are about things that are invisible to the senses, it must be at least partly misleading to try to convey messages through sensory images. So somewhere in there, there's going to be a correction. And I haven't worked it out yet, but I wouldn't expect an abundance of diagrams. Now, beyond that, there were other insights. And one of them was an understanding why life retrospections or daily retrospections must come at the end of a period of activity. Because if they don't, one finds oneself in a predicament. And it's a predicament that I find myself in right now, and that is another irony. As the result of a correction is another correction, that's kind of a an easy place to be. And when I made that observation or got that insight into it, of course, all kinds of fears arose that there could be corrections on corrections ad infinitum. Now, that's a logical but somewhat neurotic take on all of that. But in a way, something like that could become a nightmare. that if you're looking back at any time, especially in the middle of an ongoing series like we're going on, and if you start doing that too much, you're not going to make any progress. And so somehow you have to stop the whole regression of retrospection. To do that usually involves will and judgment. So after all of that, I concluded that only one correction and maybe a half on the talk that was previous to this would be important enough to go into before we return to where we were in second heaven in the post-mortem part of our life cycle, which we will get back to this evening. Now, the talk previous to this was a very brief anthropogenesis, and it was in terms of the evolution of consciousness. And that is a fancy way of saying how we became wakingly self-conscious human beings that we are now. The central point in this is that we are now, to some degree, wakingly self-conscious. We are becoming divine self-conscious beings. We're becoming the children of God, as St. John's Gospel says. That's part of the process. But being divine means being autonomous. No being in heaven or earth can coerce us into anything unless we let them. Even our participation in the divine plan, the plan behind the evolutionary creation, has to be voluntary. We have to some extent, enter freely. It's a great privilege, and now we can see that this is a wonderful decision that we've made somewhere along the line, but it has to be in freedom. Now, almost all of us have not achieved that kind of autonomy yet. We're still slaves to our desires or to our habits or things like that. But there's another side to freedom, and that is that the flip side of freedom is responsibility. Responsibility goes hand in hand with freedom. If we want greater autonomy and greater self-consciousness, the responsibility is on us. Earlier, or heretofore, in the evolutionary creation, our progress was related to externals. It was in the hands of the gods, the evolutionary or the divine hierarchies. They set up the evolutionary conditions and brought us to experience what we needed to experience. And we made progress, but our progress was in being responsive. And when we responded to what the gods were doing, we got the kind of experiences that we needed to advance. Now that we are wakingly self-conscious, we must believe, or we must become divine, and we have to be in control, even to the extent of creating and controlling the environment. Obviously, when we look around us, we're not doing such a very good job. Now, this is an exceedingly important matter. If I say it as simple as I can possibly say it, our spiritual progress is up to us, not to any other being. Only we can do it. Other people can be helpful and they can give us pointers and we can relate their experience, but only we can do the necessary work. The work, as we see the ongoing process around us, is at two levels. By far, most of it is done in daily life. Every day of our lives, there is at least one opportunity to become more spiritually awake, to see what's going on. So paying attention to life as it happens is a valid spiritual path. And for the vast majority of humanity, it's the only path. The other path is much more demanding, and it's esoteric. Both ways served the process of the evolutionary creation, and we all have to participate together in them. We can't do everything all alone. Even though we're responsible for our individual growth, we owe something to the entire cosmos and to our co-evolving beings, our friends. The esoteric way involves spiritual exercises. And in Western Christian mysticism, those exercises are based on the evolutionary creation itself. The principles that are within what we are doing are applied to have an accelerated development in that activity. So one performs spiritual exercises as regularly and as intently as possible. And the result, if we work at it, is greater consciousness and greater responsibility and more opportunities to serve in that responsibility. Now, it's not time now to talk about spiritual exercises. That would be too long and that would be too far off topic. Instead, what I'd like to address is the tone of awakening spiritual consciousness that we as spiritual aspirations are seeking, the tone, so that we can be encouraged in doing what we're doing. Now, to get at the tone of self-conscious spiritual awakening, let's briefly look at an earlier form of spiritual awakening that is still present in the world, and it is still valid to this day, and I have friends who actually do it, and some of them actually do it correctly, and that is alchemy. Alchemy is famous for being understood as a quest to turn base metals into gold. Even that selfish pursuit is figurative. The real quest was to transform the baser elements of our being into spiritual gold. It was that among the Taoist philosophers of ancient China, and it was with the alchemists of the Middle and Renaissance periods. And the gold was not only virtue, which is necessary for spiritual pursuit, it was actually the stuff that feeds the spirit. It was a form of what we've been calling the spiritualized matter. Now we're seeking the general tone of self-conscious spiritual awakening, and if we did too much of specific alchemical transformations, it would be another side trip that would take us too far off. We're more interested in the process relative to general consciousness. It is true that the alchemists did all sorts of chemical processes. Some of them were quite remarkable. A few years ago, there was a situation that the stars were in a very good position, a rare position, for producing an electrum magicum. And Jerry actually tried to produce an electrum magicum and got about 3 steps in and ran into something very difficult. And he went to the metallurgy department and he found out that he had to accomplish this in an atmosphere preferably of an inert gas in order to mix certain kinds of metals together. So those things are still done, and they're quite remarkable. Paracelsus, which is where Jerry got the formula from, made those mirrors that if you looked into the mirror, you could see, according to your consciousness, whatever you wanted that was to see that was going on anywhere in the world. But the thing we're interested in is the internal work that is parallel to the external process. Alchemy, in this regard, was an observational form of spiritual introspection. Some examples might be helpful. At one time, I became very interested in crystals. And I set out to grow evaporation and precipitation crystals. There are people that actually make a living with those kinds of crystals. It's a very exacting and it's a very tedious process because the seed crystal that you use has to be of perfect shape and very little, if at all, affected by gravity. And everything has to be pristine, no contamination of any kind, not from your skin or from a thread or anything like that. These kinds of crystals are used by physicists, solid-state physicists, by physical chemists, and by crystallographers. So what you do is you decide what mineral you want to crystallize and you make a solution of it. And then you put it in an environment that allows evaporation but no contamination from any kind of dust or any kind of fine particles of any kind. Gradually, as the evaporation takes place, which you want to take place as slowly as possible because you get more perfect crystals that way, little tiny crystals fall out. And then what you do is you take one of them, little tiny crystal, the most perfect one that you can get, and you tie it with a loop of thread, which is all right if it's an elongated kind of thing, but if you have something that is rhomboid, it's hard. It's really hard to do. And then you hang that crystal in the same solution, and it has to be perfect shape, and it has to be uncontaminated. You hang it in that same solution, and you again cover it so that nothing can get in. And when it's suspended there, you take all the other little crystals that could have been seed crystals out. And then you let it evaporate slowly, slowly. And then that seed crystal becomes a very beautiful thing. It's marvelous to see. And you can grow it to whatever size you want to grow it. I grew some crystals about that large, and it was kind of exciting for something that was really quite tedious to do. An alchemist doing this would carefully watch the whole process. And it's such a beautiful process, you can't help but to watch it. but the alchemist would watch it inwardly and outwardly. And the alchemist would say, what is this process like inside of me? And the answer that came was thinking. Because thinking is the process of, I'm trying to put two words together, of precipitating or crystallizing thoughts out of ideas. So precipitation is an activity of the concrete mind. If you've ever done a process like this or something similar, you can attest to that. Because if you're watching yourself as you're watching, like in a dream again, as you're watching an external process, you can see what you do. Now we could go into greater detail about all of that, but this is just enough to give an example of how alchemists developed the consciousness of the mind or became aware of the consciousness of the mind. Now there were all sorts of processes that they did this with. Dissolving or taking things into solution was one thing, or firing was another thing. Those were all alchemical things that had counterparts in our inner consciousness. Now we want to look at two alchemical processes. One is conventional and the other unconventional. And when it comes to me, they're probably both unconventional. The first thing is called hermetic sealing. Now, if you go to Google or Google Images, either one, and you type in hermetic sealing, hundreds of devices will come up for hermetic sealing. But none of them is an example of the way the alchemists did it. The way the alchemists did it was an overlapping spiral process, so that if anything tried to break in or tried to break out, the spiral effect would only tighten the seal. And the way it worked was, when the alchemists had everything that was necessary for the transformation they were trying to make, they put it in a vessel, often I got the right word in here somewhere, a crucible. They would put it in a crucible and they would hermetically seal it, and then they would heat it or fire it or something like that. And it was kept sealed until the transformation took place. And sometimes that was a long time. The idea of the hermetic sealing was that nothing should get in to contaminate the process. Nothing. Now, anyone who's done any creative work is an alchemist. And anyone who has done any creative work can relate to this. Because there is a time when one turns inward and when one communes with the muse, that any external input or interference will only spoil the process. It'll contaminate it. Only outward things are interruptions. They are not to the good of the process. Now, when the process is complete, or it has gotten to another level, then you can listen to other people. But in the germinal states of creation, you have to be alone with your muse, because that is your source of truth. The muse in this case just being another way of saying intuition. And so when the creative person says that the muse is jealous and will not linger and will not abide anyone from outside, that's what they're saying. If you're listening too much to things outside, you're losing touch with the creative stream that comes from within. Now, the stage in our evolution of consciousness in which we find ourselves now, the stage that we put in those hokey figures the last time we met, is like the state of things when hermetic sealing is necessary. Until now, we have been worked on by the spiritual hierarchies. The angels, the archangels, all the different beings that have worked on us to make us what we are now, and to bring up within us what is within us. Right now, we have everything we need to make the transformation that is the awakening of consciousness. So any external interjection or any control or even undue influence can only harm the process. We have everything we need. All that is necessary now is to do the great work. That is to apply the heat of will and sacrifice. Now, this is all very brief, but just to get across one simple idea. And that brings us to the other, not usually considered an alchemical process, but it's something that's quite common. My introduction to this alchemical process was startling and dramatic. It happened when I was in high school chemistry class, and I fashioned myself to be some kind of budding chemist or alchemist, and I sat in the front row. And the teacher was a wise and a clever man. He had his ways of doing things. For example, when people fell asleep during class, he had an ammonia bottle, and he'd take the top of the ammonia bottle out and he'd put it under their nose. They didn't sleep again after that. Good way to get attention. One day he came into the chemistry class with a porcelain tray about that size, a little bigger than an ashtray, and had some powder in it. And he set it on the front of the desk, very close to where I was sitting. And then he proceeded with his talk. And everyone forgot about the tray. And for quite a while, a few minutes, nothing happened. Then gradually the powder began to smoke. And before long, it burst into dazzling flame with sparks and things like that. It was a demonstration of a process called spontaneous combustion. Now, we've been talking about awakening, and we have said that awakening is probably, in our times, one of the most, if not the most important thing in our lives. Awakening is the most important part of the spiritual path. There's no greater service that we can perform than to convince people of the need to awaken and the possibility of what awakening will do for them. In reality, and I speak of myself in this, most of us are pretty close to being sleepwalkers. We're not awake, and we don't realize of a lot of what's going on around us and the effects of it in us. The world would probably be a much different place if we were more fully awake of the effects of our actions or our inactions. Awakening is like a combination of hermetic sealing and spontaneous combustion. In this process, it's like the early stages of that chemistry experiment right in front of my eyes. It seems as if nothing is happening. Sometimes we're shocked into an awakening, But if we're working on it self-consciously, it's a long, slow process. And it requires increasingly more and constant attention. But if you think about it, what else are we going to do with our consciousness? Well, I suppose we could read comic books or something like that. I'm not trying to be profound. It's merely a matter of everything that we need is within us. We don't need drugs. We don't need gurus. What we need is to do the work within, to apply ourselves consistently and intently. We can do it by being aware of the needs of people around us. Service in all spiritual schools, being attentive to what somebody needs or what they would be better without and helping them do that is a wonderful thing. Now, it helps if we have faith in the internal process. And people see the process regularly. Garagemen throw oily rags in a pile and sometimes they burst into flame. Farmers sometimes take in hay that's too green or pile too much oats on top. Make too big of a pile and you have spontaneous combustion. So people are aware of it, and if people were aware of the fact that inside of themselves there is a process that by having faith and holding the attention, using the force of will to hold the attention on a process of becoming awake, it's something anyone can do. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to be a flamboyant artist or anything like that. Anybody can do it. All it takes is application. All right, that's enough of sermonizing. Now we're ready to return to where we were in second heaven in the post-mortem half of the human life cycle. I don't know that it's half, but it's usually divided that way. It's the prenatal half and the post-mortem half. Now, when we began this sub-series about second heaven, which is what the post-mortem stay in the concrete subdivision of the world of thought is called, we said that we'd be spending relatively less time compared to the amount of time we spent on the post-mortem desire world. And at that time, one of the reasons for the short stay and one of the reasons for not much happening to us in second heaven is that we haven't done a lot of intentional, deliberate, completed thinking that produces thought forms, controlled thought forms, not little wisps of elementals. Now, this is to be expected to some extent because the mind is our most juvenile of the vehicles of consciousness. We're just beginning to think, and we don't even know how to get a hold of it. A big part of the spiritual exercise for the mind is trying to get a hold of it. In fact, it is so juvenile that almost all humans can only think in the lowest region of the subdivision of concrete thought, the continental region. And for that reason, we have very few thoughts to redeem. Because remember, in the post-mortem, redemption is all that is it about. Now, redemption in the world of thought is a very different thing than it is in the worlds that we have looked at before. There is no soul material for thought. We have conscious soul for the physical world, for the chemical subdivision of the physical world. We have intellectual soul for the etheric experience, and we have emotional soul for the desire world experience. But we don't have any soul for the world of thought. The mind, the concrete mind, is the vehicle for taking the experiences and extracting the soul material and taking them into the spirit. So it's very different. The concrete mind is both a lens and a mirror. And that is its work in the postmortem. Now, in mythology and astrology, Mercury rules the concrete mind. And in mythology, for example, Mercury was the only one of the gods that could communicate neutrally with any of the other gods. Now, understanding what this means is a very difficult thing. All of the mysteries that have to do with the mind are the most difficult. In fact, I'm probably unprepared to speak but only a little bit of what is becoming ripe to me at this time. Maybe in 2 or 3 lives I'll be able to speak differently. Now, the question that arises when we learn that we have little actual redemptive work to do in second heaven is, what do we do when we are in the world of thought after death? Are we idlers or something like that? What do we do? Now, the answer to that question requires a lot of clarification, because there are all sorts of misunderstanding about this subject. So, before we actually begin to answer, let's clarify something about our state of being or our state of consciousness in second heaven. Now, probably one of the greatest illusions that materialism has produced is that things in the higher worlds are like things in this material world. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is a parallelism between all the worlds, and the principle of analogy relates that parallelism of all the worlds, but each of the worlds is different, strikingly different. It wouldn't be very much of a rich creation if all the worlds were the same. We wouldn't have the large variety of experience that we have in evolution as it is now. Now, to get a rough idea of how it is for us in second heaven, let's briefly recount the post-mortem journey up until this point. First, the silver cord, which is a connection between our inner bodies and the outer body, has snapped, and the dense physical body is dead. Without the creative archetype holding things together, the etheric body begins to unravel. And as it does, the departed individual sees the images of all the life past, and the essence of those images is built into the desire nature, into the astral nature, and it is built into what is called the region of impressionability. When this is finished, there's no use for the dense physical body and the biological ether. the ghostly part of the vital body. So it's best to disintegrate them, probably through cremation or something like that. So, because if they're around here, if they linger here, we're not returning the elements to use, and there's something to hold us back or something for us to be attracted back to. Criminal always returns to the scene of the crime, especially if he has left evidence behind. All that's left at that point from the physical is the soul body and the foci of the physical and etheric bodies. It's something we haven't gone into. Now, some people call these foci seed atoms because they contain the essence of all the manifestations of the respective bodies. The so-called seed atom of the physical body has every physical kind of form that we've gone through, the essence of it built into it, going all the way back to when we were mineral-like. And the same is true of the etheric body. They're called seed atoms because they contain all that history in the same way that a seed carries the history of all the generations before it. These so-called seed atoms are probably special manifestations of thought, because each of our vehicles began as a thought. And there is one geminal central idea for each of our vehicles. So the spirit takes these seed atoms, and there is the essence of experience from the physical and etheric as soul material that goes with it. Along the way, a lot of that becomes absorbed and assimilated into the spirit for the awakening of the spirit. But after that, the desire body disintegrates. And it disintegrates through a neutralization. And in that neutralization, action and reaction unbind what we have tied up in emotion and desire and feeling and things like that. So gradually, the desire body disappears, and all that remains of it is the soul material and the focus that is called the seed atom of the desire body. And that's what it's like at the time when we enter second heaven. All that really remains as a vehicle of consciousness is the mind made of mind stuff. By this time, the seed atoms are concentric with the seed atom of the mind. Everything goes back to one central focus. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the next talk. Along the way, most of the soul material has been absorbed, if not all of it, and assimilated into the spirit. Now, there's a whole lot more we could say about this, but this is enough for now. It is a gross thing to do, but if we were to describe the form of our being at this time, it would be a spherical ball of light, the light of thought stuff. It would have an indistinct surface, not like the surface of a bubble. And the way we relate to each other or recognize each other is by the tone of thought and the light. Each of us has a distinct tone of thought, and each of us has a distinct light. Artists, musicians, and painters recognize things like this, that each one has a different tone or each one has a different light. The tone seems to some extent correspond to the voice of the person when the person is speaking physically. Even here, we recognize this. If I'm walking along and one of my friends is coming from the opposite direction, I can recognize immediately that it's one of my friends. Now, in this, mystics sometimes make very bold statements. And those bold statements are so big that it's hard to grasp them with full comprehension. For example, Max Heindel says something to the effect that all alternating vibration or oscillation is ruled by Mercury. Mercury, who rules the concrete mind. He goes on to give an example. He says the vocal cords are ruled by Taurus. That part of the body is ruled by Taurus. But the air that vibrates them is ruled by Mercury. Now, there's a cheap way of saying it that at this point in the life cycle, our appearance would be something like a singing ball of light. Folklore would have it that we play harps, but the reality is that we are singing, emanating our spiritual being through thought. There is something to the whole idea of harps too, but that's way extraneous to what we're trying to do. Now, it's important to remember in this that this is a baseline state of being. And there's not a lot of self-consciousness. It would seem like a stupendous amount to hear, but it's really not relative to the overall state of things. So not a whole lot of creative thinking is taking place. Just like we said, it's very hard to do forward-going work in the time when there is the retrospection. Things are going backward. So this brings us to our question, what do we do in the world of thought after death? We don't twiddle our thumbs. Now, this is going to sound crazy, but before we can try to answer that, it seems appropriate to review what we have just reviewed, but in a different way. And this review will be very brief. When we're in the dense physical body, we are located. We are located in a specific place in time and space. When we're in the ethers, our relation to reality is loosened. It's more broad. We can experience things in time and space much more than we do in physical things. For example, a lot of, it's the modern thing now to talk about etheric awareness of things in the distance using things like quantum entanglement, which is not as good as actually seeing it in mysticism. Our view of time is also broadened. Obviously, it has to be for us to see all of the things of our past. But we can also see the future. We can see things that are coming into the being of the forces, in the forces that crystallize things in the chemicals of the dense physical world. If we work as invisible helpers, if we're just out of our bodies and we're somewhat aware, when we come to our physical bodies in the morning, when we wake up, we pass through the ethers. And sometimes, if we're on the watch, we can see events that are coming into being. Events in our life and sometimes events in the world. And it's a helpful thing. We can prepare other people if we know what's coming and if we're careful about how we do it. When we get to the desire world, consciousness is broadened even more. We saw that in purgatory and first heaven, our consciousness seemed expanded to the whole desire world, and we saw ourselves as if seeing ourselves without, seeing ourselves as others see it. And the experience for some people is that in part of the emotional consciousness, they're blown up like huge balloons or something like that. Now, when we get to second heaven, our consciousness, even if it's not fully waking, is much, much broader. It gets to the very extent of the concrete realms of creation. We can relate to anything in the concrete cosmos. We can think, though it is difficult to do so self-consciously, creatively about anything concrete. Now comes the hard part, the part that is most easily misunderstood. In the world of thought, our consciousness has become so expanded that we are at the foundation of nature. Not the foundation in spirit, but in concrete nature. And we are so universalized that we are actually nature forces spread throughout the cosmos. What is taking place chemically in this world, we are part of the forces of that happening. We are divine creators in that sense. Now we can understand that in a small, indirect way even when we're here. We see our thoughts have an effect on the environment. But in the world of thought, it's much greater and it's much more direct. We are literally nature forces. This is so even if we are not self-consciously awake. Even if we are not thinking deliberately, this is so. Now, St. Paul tells us we are a peculiar people. And we are a peculiar people because in our place in the evolutionary creation, being centered right in the middle of it, we're capable of creating at any level in the solar manifestation. Though most of those, the deeply spiritual ones, are far in the future for us. Now that kind of a thought leaves me breathless. We can think and create in anything in the cosmos. It also leaves one in a kind of a humbled state. The thought that or awareness staggers the consciousness at the responsibility of it. Every thought precipitates something in creation. This is something not to be wasted in unconsciousness. And the divine beings do not waste it. All of it is used. Now, the way this works, which is something I'm not totally certain that I completely understand, or maybe only understand a very little bit of it, it is that we are creative instruments. We are elemental creative forces, even in our semi-consciousness or relative unconsciousness. So we're part of the molding of the mountains or the erosion of them. It's probably that we are only active or mostly active in chemical formation because we think in our minds at this time only in the continental region of the concrete subdivision of the world of thought. We have not yet learned to think life, and we have not yet learned to think emotion. We can do those things to some extent under the influence of higher beings. And above all, we can't think thinking. That's very, very far in the future. Adepts who do work consciously can do these things. Now, there's an important ethical point in all of this. The divine beings who use us never enter into or invade the autonomy of our being. They don't try to pierce or penetrate the hermetic ceiling. They wouldn't be divine beings if they did so. They would be monstrous demons. Our spiritual sovereignty is sacred, and it is divinely respected. Now, when we discuss abstruse matters deep into spiritual worlds, we have to remember that things there aren't as they are here. The use of us is not an overpowering. It is not an overpowering such as hypnotism is. It's probably more like being brought to our semi-conscious attention step-by-step programmed learning. It's as if someone is walking you through it, allowing you to do the work, but walking you through it. Now, if eternal or ethical thought transference is like sympathetic vibration, if you set a tuning fork going, any other tuning fork of that same pitch will vibrate if it's within range. Therefore, each one must respond in sympathetic vibration and not because something is hammered into them. Now, there seems to be a principle in the evolutionary creation that is much like our school system, that when a being evolves to a new level of creativity, it has to forego the lesser functionality that it has just evolved out of. That which it has evolved out of is left to those following behind, so that they can advance also. Thus, the beings who use us could function as creative elemental forces if they wanted to, but that would be a great waste of their creative talents. And the creation has no room for waste. We wouldn't have the creative apprenticeship we have now if those beings chose to stay doing that. There are a few exceptions to this, and one of these exceptions is the incarnation of Christ, which was a rare exception, and it was because of our dire need, and it was done with very, very great sacrifice. So in all of this, we benefit as journeyman creators, albeit not being fully conscious. Now, this is not the first and only way that we have been used as evolutionary instruments. In our brief human career, it has happened other times. All Christian mystics seem in agreement about an earlier stage of this activity. The case that is most commonly pointed to is in what is called in the book of Genesis the naming of the animals. That we name the animals. And if you read it in the Bible, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you. Mark Twain had a lot of fun of it. He wrote a piece called The Diary of Adam and Eve. And Adam writes in the diary, "She did it to me again. We were naming animals, and she said, 'Let's call this one a cow.' And I said to her, why do you want to call it a cow?" And she said, "It looks like a cow, doesn't it?" That's self-evident feminine intuition. In one of the animal-like recapitulations, we recapitulated animal stages by living through them and throwing them off or discarding them, because to have kept them would have prevented us from becoming truly human. Those forms that we rejected or ejected, probably both, were used by the animal group spirits for their wards to use and evolve. If I understand it correctly, they were probably key types at main evolutionary branches, if you're thinking in terms of that kind of evolutionary form, because I can't see human, it doesn't seem efficient. There have been, right now there are hundreds of millions of species, and there have been many hundreds of millions before these that are no longer with us, and I can't see us having gone through them, so I think it's probably through key species. Now, one way of understanding this activity where we become creative nature forces is to conceive of ourselves as musical instruments. One doesn't invade the integrity of a musical instrument. One influences it. In fact, music is a way of understanding the world of thought. We each have our own pitch, which is our own keyword, and strings of thought are like melodies. Of course, it's much more complicated than that, because there are so many beings active in the world of thought. And then there are the great divine beings that are booming out the archetypal thoughts from which we all build. So in order to do something in the inner worlds, musicians must really have to work at this. It requires selective listening, because you can't listen to it all. It's probably much more, hundreds of times more complicated than when a symphony orchestra is tuning before the concert. Now there's another example that might help to understand the ethics and the process. It's not perfect as an example, but it gives an understanding of our creative thinking or our creative singing in the world of thought. If one suppose you're going in a shopping mall and there is music in the background of the shopping mall, you might not even be fully conscious of it, but yet it affects you, and it affects your mood. It might even stimulate to buy more, make more purchases. And when that influence, when you find yourself singing the tune that you're not even aware of, that's sort of what it's like when the background of the divine beings are working on us in the second heaven. Now that's all I had time to put together for tonight, but I think it gives a good idea of what we are doing in second heaven, even though we are not fully self-consciously awake, even though it's much more than we're here. Any questions? Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It's again like